Here is something that almost nobody in mainstream media will say out loud on March 31st, 2026. The most consequential miscalculation of the 21st century was not the invasion of Iraq, and it was not the 2008 financial crisis. The most consequential miscalculation was this. The entire Western world looked at Iran and assumed it was manageable, containable, defeatable. That assumption is now costing the global economy trillions of dollars, and the bill is only getting started. What makes this story so important is not just the military dimension. Missiles and drone strikes make headlines, but they are symptoms, not the disease. The disease is something much deeper. It is a structural failure of strategic imagination that built up slowly, quietly, over decades. For years, Western governments, financial institutions, and intelligence agencies operated on one core assumption about Iran. That assumption was that Iran would eventually break under economic pressure, that sanctions would force it to the table on Western terms, that the combination of financial isolation and military deterrence would keep Iran contained and the global order permanently stable. Every single one of those assumptions turned out to be wrong, and the consequences of that mistake are visible everywhere right now. Fuel prices in Southeast Asia are spiking so fast that governments cannot keep up. Supply chains that took decades to build are fracturing almost overnight. Energy markets that were supposed to be stable are behaving in ways that even veteran traders say they have never seen before. This is not a temporary disruption. This is a structural shift, and the question that matters is not who fired what missile at whom. The question that matters is, why did the world get Iran so completely wrong? And what does that miscalculation mean for your economy right now? To answer that, you need to start at the very beginning, because the underestimation of Iran did not happen overnight. It was built layer by layer over decades. And to understand how the world arrived here, you need to understand what Iran actually is, not what decades of Western media told you it was. Iran is not a failed state. It is not a fragile regime held together by oil money and fear. Iran is a civilization, one of the oldest continuous ones on the planet. A country of over 85 million people, with a highly educated population, a functioning industrial base, and a geography that controls some of the most critical waterways on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage between Iran and Oman, is the single most important choke point in global energy infrastructure. Approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through that strait every single day, one narrow body of water, and Iran sits directly on one side of it. That geography alone should have made every strategic planner in Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo pause before pursuing a policy of maximum pressure against Iran. But they did not pause. They pressed forward. And now the global economy is living with the consequences of that decision in real time. In my view, what happened was a failure of institutional imagination, the inability of large systems to genuinely consider scenarios outside their established models. Western planners looked at Iran's GDP, roughly $400 billion compared to America's $28 trillion, and concluded that economic pressure would inevitably win. But GDP does not measure resilience. It does not measure strategic patience or the willingness of a society to absorb decades of pain rather than surrender on humiliating terms. Iran has been absorbing economic pain for over 40 years. Since the 1979 revolution, Iran has lived under some form of Western sanctions for virtually its entire modern existence. An entire generation of Iranians, engineers, scientists, military planners, economists, grew up inside a sanctions environment. They did not just survive it. They adapted to it. They built parallel systems, alternative supply chains, domestic manufacturing capabilities, and financial networks operating entirely outside the Western banking system. They did not just endure the pressure. They used it to build something that most Western analysts never took seriously, until now. And that is the part that Western strategic models consistently failed to account for. Resilience is not visible on a spreadsheet. Adaptation does not show up in GDP figures. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a like and tell me in the comments. Did your country see this coming, or did it get caught completely off guard just like everyone else? Because the next part of this story is where it gets truly global, and where the economic consequences start hitting people who have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz in their lives. Here is the number that should be on the front page of every financial newspaper in the world right now, but is not. $42 trillion. That is the estimated total value of goods and services that flow through global supply chains connected to Gulf energy every single year. And right now, in March 2026, that entire system is under pressure in ways it has not experienced since the oil shocks of the 1970s. But here is what makes this moment different from the 1970s. Back then, the disruption was temporary. Governments knew it would end. Markets knew it would end. And it did. What analysts at institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are now quietly acknowledging is that this disruption may not end. Not in the way the world has come to expect. Because the infrastructure of the global economy, the shipping routes, the pricing mechanisms, the currency arrangements, was built around one central assumption. That assumption was stable, predictable, affordable energy flowing out of the Persian Gulf without interruption year after year, decade after decade. Iran's actions over the past several months have not just disrupted that flow. They have introduced something far more damaging than a temporary shortage. They have introduced permanent uncertainty. And permanent uncertainty is, in many ways, more destructive to an economy than even a complete supply cutoff. Because businesses can plan around a cutoff, they cannot plan around unpredictability. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in practice, because this is where the story stops being abstract and starts being about real people and real economies. Thailand, a country of 70 million people, a major manufacturing hub, one of Southeast Asia's most important economies. In March 2026, Thailand is experiencing fuel shortages at a scale not seen in decades. Trucking companies in Bangkok are canceling deliveries because diesel availability has become unreliable. Factories in the industrial zones east of the capital are cutting production shifts. Airlines operating out of Suvarnabhumi Airport have begun quietly reducing flight frequencies because jet fuel procurement has become both expensive and uncertain at the same time. This is not a Thai problem. This is a global problem wearing a Thai face. The same dynamic is playing out in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, across the entire region. And the reason it is hitting Southeast Asia first and hardest is something that most Western coverage of this conflict completely ignores. Southeast Asian economies operate with very thin financial buffers. They do not have the strategic reserves that America maintains. They do not have the financial depth of the European Union. When energy costs spike suddenly, they cannot absorb the shock gradually over months. The impact arrives almost immediately in fuel prices, in food costs, in manufacturing output, in employment. What this suggests is that the global economic pain from this conflict is not going to distribute itself evenly. It is going to concentrate in the places that are least able to absorb it. And Southeast Asia is just the beginning. Because the energy disruption rippling out of the Gulf right now is not hitting one region. It is hitting every economy simultaneously, just in different ways and at different speeds. Now I want to talk about something that almost no mainstream outlet is covering properly, because it requires understanding how the global oil pricing system actually works. Most people assume that if you do not import oil from Iran directly, then conflict involving Iran does not affect your energy costs. That assumption is fundamentally incorrect. Here's why. Oil is priced globally. When supply uncertainty enters the market anywhere, whether it is Iranian oil, Saudi oil, or Kuwaiti oil, the price signal travels everywhere instantly. The moment a tanker captain in the Gulf of Oman makes the decision to reroute around a potential conflict zone, insurance premiums for every ship in the region increase within hours. Those increased insurance costs get passed directly into the price of every barrel of oil shipped from the Gulf, regardless of its origin and regardless of its destination. This is the mechanism that connects a conflict in the Persian Gulf to a gas station in Poland, a factory in South Korea, and a fishing boat in Nigeria simultaneously. And in 2026, that mechanism is working exactly as described. Energy costs are rising in economies that have no direct involvement in this conflict whatsoever. Germany, which has been working hard to reduce its energy dependence since the Russia-Ukraine war, is now facing a second wave of energy cost pressure from an entirely different direction. Japanese manufacturing companies, already squeezed by years of yen weakness, are now recalculating their production costs upward as Gulf energy uncertainty feeds into their supply chains. In my view, the most important thing to understand about this moment is that the global economy is not facing a single shock. It is facing a compounding series of shocks arriving simultaneously. The Russia-Ukraine conflict already restructured European energy markets. Now the Gulf conflict is restructuring Asian and global energy markets on top of that restructuring. Each individual shock might be manageable in isolation, but compounding shocks hitting an already stressed global system, that is a different category of problem entirely. And the deeper you look at the numbers, the clearer it becomes that the world genuinely did not price in the possibility that Iran could sustain this level of strategic pressure for this long. The financial models used by the world's largest banks and investment institutions had Iran folding under military and economic pressure within weeks. Those models are now being quietly revised. What the revision process looks like in practice is that risk premiums are being added to everything connected to Gulf energy: shipping, insurance, futures contracts, long-term supply agreements. And risk premiums, once added to a system, are extremely difficult to remove, because removing them requires a level of confidence in future stability that takes years to rebuild. That is the hidden long-term cost of underestimating Iran. Not just the immediate disruption, but the permanent repricing of global risk that follows when a foundational assumption turns out to be wrong. Nobody is talking about the number that explains everything. And that number is not an oil price. It is not a GDP figure. It is 21 days. 21 days is the average amount of time it takes for a disruption in Gulf energy supply to show up as a price increase on a supermarket shelf in a major Asian city. Not months, not weeks, 21 days. That is how tightly the global food system is connected to Gulf energy. And that connection is now under severe stress. Here is the mechanism that most people never think about. Modern industrial agriculture does not run on soil and sunlight. It runs on fertilizer, and fertilizer runs on natural gas. Approximately 80% of the world's nitrogen fertilizer is produced using natural gas as the primary input. No cheap gas means no affordable fertilizer. No affordable fertilizer means lower crop yields. Lower crop yields in a world of 8 billion people is not an abstract statistic. It is a direct line from a conflict in the Persian Gulf to food prices in countries that have never imported a single barrel of Iranian oil. This is the part of the Iran story that the financial media consistently undercovers, because it does not fit the clean narrative of a military conflict between specific governments. The food-energy connection means that this conflict has already embedded itself into the daily lives of ordinary people on every continent, whether they realize it or not. In Egypt, which imports over 50% of its wheat and relies heavily on subsidized bread to feed a population of over 100 million people, energy cost increases translate directly into fiscal crisis. The Egyptian government spends billions of dollars annually maintaining food and fuel subsidies. When global energy prices spike, the cost of those subsidies rises, and the government has to choose between cutting them or going deeper into debt. That choice, between cutting subsidies that millions of people depend on and accumulating debt that eventually becomes unsustainable, is a choice that multiple governments across the Middle East and Africa are now facing simultaneously. In my view, this is one of the most underappreciated dimensions of the Iran conflict. The military and geopolitical story gets all the attention. The humanitarian and economic story in third countries gets almost none. Now let us talk about China, because China's position in this story is more complicated and more vulnerable than most coverage suggests. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy from the Gulf region. That single number should stop every conversation about Chinese economic strength in its tracks. Because it means that China, the world's second largest economy, the country positioning itself as the alternative to American global leadership, is structurally dependent on the same energy supply chain this conflict is disrupting. Beijing has been working for years to reduce that dependence. Pipeline deals with Russia, investments in Central Asian energy infrastructure, domestic renewable energy expansion on a massive scale. But here is the problem with energy transitions. They take time. A decade minimum for structural change at the scale China requires. And right now, China does not have a decade. It has today. And today, Chinese factories that supply global markets with everything from electronics to pharmaceuticals are running cost calculations that looked very different 6 months ago. What this suggests is that the global manufacturing system, which relocated to China precisely because of low costs, is now facing a cost structure that fundamentally undermines the logic of that relocation. Companies that spent billions building supply chains centered on Chinese manufacturing are now doing the math on whether those supply chains still make economic sense in a world of expensive Gulf energy. That recalculation is already happening inside the boardrooms of major multinational corporations. It is quiet, it is gradual, and it is irreversible once it reaches a certain threshold. And the deeper issue for China is this: its domestic consumer economy, the backup plan when export manufacturing weakens, is not performing the way Beijing needs it to perform. Chinese household savings rates remain exceptionally high. Consumers are holding on to their money rather than spending it. And consumer confidence data from early 2026 reflects real anxiety about economic stability. So China finds itself in a position where its primary economic engine is under pressure from rising energy costs, and its backup engine is not firing. That is a very difficult position to be in, and that difficulty matters for the entire world, because China absorbing an economic shock of this magnitude does not stay inside China's borders. It travels through supply chains, through commodity markets, through the financial systems of every country that trades with China, which is to say, virtually every country on Earth. Here is the question that every government economist, every central bank analyst, and every corporate strategist is now asking behind closed doors, but almost nobody is asking in public. What does a world without a stable Gulf actually look like? Not for a week, not for a month, but structurally, permanently, as the new baseline reality? Because that is the scenario that is quietly moving from the realm of worst-case thinking into the realm of serious planning. And the answers are deeply uncomfortable. For the past 50 years, global economic architecture was built on 3 pillars: cheap Gulf energy, open global trade, and American military guarantees backing both of those things. All 3 of those pillars are now under simultaneous pressure for the first time in modern history. And when foundational pillars crack at the same time, the structure above them does not gradually weaken. It shifts suddenly. The nations that understood this early, that saw the fragility underneath the stability, have been quietly repositioning for years. And their moves tell a very revealing story. India has been accelerating its domestic refinery capacity and diversifying its energy suppliers across multiple continents simultaneously. That is not a reaction to this conflict. That is preparation for exactly this scenario. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 program, often discussed purely as an economic modernization project, is also, fundamentally, a hedge against a future where petrodollar revenues can no longer be taken for granted. Russia, despite its own severe economic pressures from Western sanctions, has spent years building energy relationships with China, India, and Turkey that bypass the Western financial system entirely. These moves did not happen by accident. They happened because certain governments looked at the same structural fragilities that Western institutions ignored and took them seriously. In my view, the deepest lesson of this entire situation is not about Iran specifically. It is about the danger of institutional consensus, the moment when everyone in a system agrees on the same assumption. When every major bank, every intelligence agency, every government planning department operates on the same foundational belief, there is nobody left inside the system to stress test that belief. And the belief that went untested for decades was this: that the global order built after 1945, reinforced after 1991, was stable enough to be treated as permanent infrastructure rather than a temporary arrangement. It was never permanent. It was always a specific historical configuration that required constant maintenance, constant adaptation, and constant honest reassessment to survive. That maintenance did not happen. That reassessment was consistently deferred. And the cost of that deferral is what the global economy is now beginning to pay. Now, what does this mean practically for the years ahead? Because this is where analysis has to connect to reality for ordinary people, not just for governments and institutions. The era of cheap, predictable, globally available energy is not coming back. That is not pessimism. That is a structural observation based on where supply chains, geopolitical alignments, and energy infrastructure are all pointing simultaneously. What replaces it will be a more regionalized world. A world where energy security means domestic production or very close regional partnerships, not dependence on supply chains running through contested waterways. Countries that have domestic energy resources, whether fossil fuels, renewables, or nuclear, are going to have a structural economic advantage over countries that do not, for the foreseeable future. Countries that have been slow to develop those resources, that assumed cheap imports would always be available, are now facing an adjustment that will be measured not in quarters, but in decades. And the global trading system, the one that made cheap manufactured goods available everywhere, that created the consumer economy most people in the developed world take for granted, that system is being repriced, not destroyed. Repriced. The goods will still move. The trade will still happen. But the cost structure underneath it is permanently changing, and those changes will show up in prices, in supply availability, and in economic growth rates for years to come. Here's what I think matters most as a final thought. The world did not underestimate Iran because it lacked information. The information was available. The geography was visible on any map. The world underestimated Iran because it was convenient to underestimate it. Because the alternative, taking the fragility of the global system seriously, would have required difficult, expensive, politically uncomfortable decisions. Decisions about energy independence. Decisions about supply chain resilience. Decisions about the limits of military power as a tool of economic policy. Those decisions were deferred, and deferred decisions in complex systems do not disappear. They accumulate interest, and eventually they come due, usually all at once, and always at the worst possible moment. That moment appears to be now, and the global economy is only beginning to calculate the true cost of getting Iran, and the system built around containing it, so completely wrong. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, subscribe and leave a comment below. What do you think the global economy looks like in 5 years if this situation does not resolve? I read every single response.